On the morning of Friday, May 21st, 2010, 68-year-old Dennis Kola sat down for breakfast with his wife Myrna inside of their kitchen in their spacious 4-bedroom house in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Dennis picked up the newspaper and, like always, began reading the front page out loud to Myrna. This was an activity the couple enjoyed doing together every morning. According to the story on the front page, the stock market was struggling and unemployment was on the rise. But Myrna didn't bat an eye. She knew that she and Dennis would be fine because they had made a ton of money throughout their 42-year marriage by owning multiple successful businesses, from a chain of pharmacies to a Ford car dealership that Dennis owned with his son. But a few years earlier, Dennis had seen the writing on the wall when it came to the country's economy. So he had sold his businesses before things got too bad, and he had walked away with enough money for him and Myrna to be set for the rest of their lives without having to work. But the truth was, Dennis and Myrna actually loved to work, kind of independent of making money, so they weren't quite ready to just full-on retire. And so after selling his companies, Dennis had returned to his old job as a pharmacist, and Myrna worked at a local middle school as a substitute teacher. And so on this Friday morning, because of his work commitments, Dennis didn't have time to read beyond just the first few pages of the newspaper. After putting the paper down, Dennis finished his breakfast, then gave his wife a kiss on the cheek and told her he loved her, and then he walked out the front door. Once outside, Dennis climbed into his truck and began the 40-mile drive to the nearby town where he worked at this local pharmacy. And while Dennis made his commute, Myrna cleaned up the kitchen and then headed out to work herself. And as she drove the short distance to West Salem Middle School, she passed by all these mini mansions that were just like hers, with wide, well-manicured lawns, and then she drove by the neighborhood golf course and banquet hall. Myrna couldn't picture a better place for her and Dennis to grow old together, a small community filled with friends where she always felt comfortable and safe. And she loved how close her neighborhood was to the rest of her family. Dennis and Myrna had 2 grown children who also had children of their own, and Myrna thought there was nothing better than having the family over and spending time with the grandkids she adored. Myrna finally arrived at the middle school, and she went inside and walked down a long hall to the classroom where she had been assigned that day. She opened the door, and the faces of the students lit up. Myrna was the kids' favorite substitute teacher. The school day passed quickly for Myrna, and as always, she made each period pass just as quickly for her students by making sure the lessons were actually fun. Myrna had always believed that learning should be an enjoyable experience and not a slog where every minute feels like an hour. Myrna worked that day at the school until around 3 p.m., and then the final bell rang, and she told her class to have a great weekend, and she said she'd be back as their substitute on Monday. Then Myrna headed outside, hopped in her car, and made her way home, and then once there, she did some chores around the house, and when she was done with her housework, she sat down in the home office and logged onto her computer. About 45 minutes later, around 6 p.m., her husband, Dennis, pulled back up to the house after his day of work. He parked his truck and made his way onto the porch, eager to get inside and have dinner with his wife. Dennis opened the door and walked through the hallway toward the kitchen, his keys dangling from his hand, and then Dennis stepped into the kitchen and called out to his wife. And then suddenly, everything went black. Three days later, on Monday at 7:50 a.m., the morning bell rang at West Salem Middle School, marking the beginning of the official day. Students all took their seats in all the classrooms, and the school kind of went quiet as the teachers began their lessons. That is, in every classroom but one. In that one classroom, the chair behind the teacher's desk remained empty, and so the students in that classroom just remained standing up and chatting with each other, aware of the fact that their teacher was not there, but not that worried because they liked having some extra time. However, these students' obvious restlessness caught the ear of an administrator who happened to be walking by the classroom. And the administrator stepped into the room and asked what was going on, and the students said their substitute teacher still hadn't shown up. Concerned, the administrator told the students to wait quietly, and then he returned to the front office to double-check the schedule. This was the class that Myrna Kola had been assigned to teach that week, and apparently she had just not shown up for work and didn't tell anybody. The administrator pulled up Myrna's file and dialed her phone number, but no one answered. So the administrator checked Myrna's emergency contact info, and he found it was her son, Eric. Eric Kola was home with his wife when he got the phone call from the administrator. Eric told the administrator that he had no idea why his mom wouldn't show up for work, but he told him he'd try to get in touch with her and report back as soon as he could. Eric hung up and dialed his mom's cell phone, but it just rang and rang until it went to voicemail. So Eric called his father, who at this point in the morning would have been in his truck on his way to work, and so in theory would have been ready to receive a phone call, but he too did not answer his phone. After both parents didn't pick up, Eric turned to his wife, looking concerned, and said something wasn't right, that this was totally out of character for his parents to just go completely incommunicado. And so Eric called his sister, Cindy, and asked her if she had had any contact with their parents, but Cindy said that she hadn't talked to them since before the weekend. After Eric ended this call, he told his wife that he was just going to go to his parents' house to see what the heck was going on. And about 10 minutes later, Eric slowed his truck to a stop in front of the house, and he saw his dad's truck was out front. Eric parked, walked up the driveway to the side of the house, and he looked into his parents' 3-car garage. And he could see his mother's car, a Mountaineer, was also parked inside, so his parents had to be home. Eric opened the garage with the opener his parents had given him, he walked past his mother's SUV, and then he opened the unlocked door to the house and stepped inside. And as he walked towards the kitchen, he saw his father. Dennis was lying there, motionless on the kitchen floor. Eric ran to his father, and he saw there was a pool of blood all around him. Eric got down on the floor and grabbed his dad's leg, desperately trying to shake him awake. But not only was Dennis unresponsive, his body was totally stiff. And so in a panic, Eric grabbed his phone and dialed 911, and when the operator answered, he told them as best as he could what he had seen, and the operator, who was very calm, asked Eric if anyone else was in the house. And so Eric, who didn't know, began walking down the hall, and when he looked into the office, he cried out. There was his mother, slumped over the desk at the computer. Her skin had turned purple. The operator calmly asked Eric if his mother was still breathing, and Eric replied that no, she wasn't, that both of his parents had to be dead. A little while after Eric's 911 call, Agent John Christopherson of the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation and members of his team arrived at the Colas house. Christopherson saw 2 deputies from the La Crosse County Sheriff's Department talking to Eric in the front yard. And he saw several of the Colas neighbors standing on their porches, looking completely stunned by all the police activity. I mean, this stuff didn't happen in this neighborhood. Christopherson knew major crime was rare in this community, and a double homicide was basically unheard of. That was a big reason Christopherson and the state police had been brought in to lead this investigation. Agent Christopherson got out of his car, walked across the yard, and introduced himself to the deputies and to Eric. And he let them both know that he'd be back soon to ask some questions. Then he led members of his team into the Colas house. The smell of decomposing bodies hit them immediately, and the smell instantly told them that the victims must have been dead for quite a while. Christopherson walked to the kitchen, and he saw Dennis lying face down on the floor. Dennis was surrounded by a pool of coagulated blood, and he had a hole in the right side of his head. Dennis was still wearing his jacket, and his car keys were clutched tightly in his hand. So Christopherson figured that Dennis must have been shot shortly after he walked through the front door of his house. After looking around the kitchen, Christopherson walked down the hall to the office, where he knew the second victim had been found. He saw Myrna's body hunched over the desk. She had an obvious bullet wound in the back of her head, and her left arm was resting on the computer keyboard, as if she had been typing when someone walked up behind her and shot her. Christopherson turned around and glanced back at the office door. He wondered if the killer had stood there and watched this woman at her computer before shooting her. There was something cold-blooded about the idea, like a predator observing its prey before moving in for the kill. While Christopherson searched the office, a member of the investigative team walked inside and told Christopherson that he needed to see something upstairs. So Christopherson followed the officer up a carpeted staircase, down a hallway, and into Myrna and Dennis's bedroom. It appeared like the room had been ransacked. All of the dresser drawers had been pulled open, but as Christopherson walked across the room to the dresser, he felt like there was something unusual about the bedroom scene. Their dresser drawers had all been pulled out and left open in a way that a robber wouldn't have actually been able to see what was in each drawer, and it didn't look like anyone had actually dug through the drawers or taken anything. So Christopherson wondered if maybe the killer had tried to stage the room to look like a robbery, even though that's not what it was. Christopherson continued to walk around the room, and he quickly found pieces of Myrna's very expensive jewelry just sitting out, untouched, so that only added to his suspicion that the apparent ransacking in the bedroom really had been staged. Christopherson finished searching the room and then made his way down the hall to an upstairs guest room. This room looked untouched. But then, when he opened the door to a walk-in closet inside of this room, something immediately caught the agent's eye. It was a .22 caliber rifle propped up against the wall. Christopherson looked up, and he saw, on a shelf right above the rifle, was an opened box of ammunition. He kneeled down to look closer at the rifle, and he noticed there was an indentation in the carpet nearby that was about the same size and shape as the butt of the gun. It looked like the indentation was where the rifle had been resting, but then just recently, someone must have moved that rifle, and when they returned it, they didn't put it back exactly where they'd found it, in the indentation. Christofferson had a member of his team bag the rifle and the box of ammunition and booked them into evidence. Then, Christofferson headed downstairs and outside and joined the deputies who were talking to Eric. After telling Eric how sorry he was for his loss, Christofferson said, "Look, I have to ask you right now about what you know, because this is a murder investigation and this needs to move quickly." And so he asked Eric when was the last time he saw his parents alive. Eric said it had been Thursday night, so 4 nights earlier. He had stopped by the house to help his mother do laundry and to help his father replace some boards out on the deck. And before Eric left, Eric told Christofferson that his father had said to him, "I love you, son." And Eric had said back, "Yeah, I love you too, Dad." He said that was the last time they actually spoke. Eric did tell Christofferson that weekend he had tried calling his parents to invite them to a cookout, but they didn't pick up, so he left a voicemail, and his parents didn't call him back, but he didn't think it was that big of a deal because he knew his parents had plans with friends that weekend. After hearing this, Christofferson asked Eric if he knew of anyone who might have access to his parents' residence. Eric said he couldn't think of anyone specifically, but he did say his parents often kept their doors unlocked. This didn't really surprise Christofferson because that's how safe this community was. But now he wondered if maybe someone had exploited that sense of security and just slipped inside the house through an unlocked door. As Eric continued to speak with Christofferson and the other police officers, Eric's sister, Cindy Cowell, arrived at the property. And as she walked across the yard towards them, Christofferson could tell she'd been crying. After Cindy walked over to them, she gave her brother a hug, and the two of them did their best to comfort each other and also to provide any additional information that might help. But neither of them could think of anyone who might have had a motive to kill their parents. And so this double murder was turning into a total mystery. The next day, the medical examiner performed autopsies on Dennis and Myrna, and the results were far from surprising. Each had been shot in the head. But there was an important detail. The bullet that had struck them in the head was a .22 caliber bullet. And this was an important detail for Christofferson because it was the same caliber bullet used in the rifle he'd found in the upstairs bedroom closet. And that rifle had clearly been recently moved because of that indentation he saw in the carpet. And Christofferson thought that if that rifle was the murder weapon, then the killer had to have known Dennis and Myrna well enough to know where they kept that gun. Christofferson wanted to develop a timeline of the Colas' last day. However, the autopsies did not pinpoint the exact times of their deaths, so he still wasn't even sure what day they had died. But one thing he did know was that Myrna had clearly been using her computer when she was killed, so his team sent Myrna's computer to a forensic data lab where the hard drive could be analyzed for timestamps. And this data revealed that Myrna had begun using her computer at exactly 5:14 p.m. on Friday, May 21st, and her very last keystroke was made at 5:41 p.m. that same evening. And so Christofferson believed that 5:41 p.m. on May 21st was the exact time of Myrna's death. Then Christofferson, using this information, figured out when Dennis had left work on that day and how long generally it would take Dennis to drive back home. And based on this, Christofferson concluded that Dennis most likely got home around 6 p.m. So he estimated that Dennis's time of death was about 20 minutes after his wife's death. So at this point, Christofferson knew that the Colas had very likely been killed in the early evening of May 21st, 3 days before they were actually discovered. And also, based on the timeline, whoever had shot Myrna had very likely waited inside of the house to then kill Dennis when he walked inside. Christofferson knew that Dennis and Myrna were well off financially, and they had multiple investments and life insurance policies with very big payouts, so money had to be considered as a potential motive. And investigators soon learned that the beneficiaries of Dennis and Myrna's life insurance policies were their kids, Eric and Cindy, and they stood to inherit over $700,000 each. And so obviously when you include the fact that Eric was the one who found the bodies, this made the kids highly suspicious. And so Christofferson decided he would speak to them both, but he would start with Eric. And so the day after the discovery of the bodies, Eric arrived at the police station and he sat down across from Christofferson inside of a small interview room. And Eric appeared to be very grief-stricken, but at the same time, Christofferson could tell Eric was eager to help. He spoke in a cooperative tone and never came across as defensive. And so the first question Christofferson asked Eric was, how was his relationship with his parents? Eric said he had always gotten along with both of his parents. He said his father was a great business partner because they worked at that car dealership together, and also they played golf together all the time. Eric said he also made a point to see his mother as much as he could and also help her out around the house because she refused to slow down even though she was almost 70. After that, Kristofferson asked Eric to walk him through what he did all day on Friday, May 21st, which is again the day that Kristofferson believed the two victims were killed. Eric said that day he spent the morning and afternoon doing what he normally did, day trading. Day trading is a form of securities trading where the trader buys stocks and other assets and then sells them the same day, taking advantage of price fluctuations that occur between the opening and closing of the trading day. And Eric would say he was actually a pretty successful day trader, often pulling in between $7,000 and $10,000 a month. The only downside being that it required him to sit at home on his computer for hours and hours on end. After he finally got up from his computer, he left his house to meet up with his friend to help grout and tile a shower. He said he was with that friend until about 5:30 p.m., and then he went to pick up his wife at home because they were going out to celebrate their 16th wedding anniversary. Now, to this point in the interview, it was very cut and dry. Eric is doing his best to be composed, but at this point, Eric just suddenly shook his head and began laughing. Kristofferson was very surprised at this and asked, did I miss something funny? Eric stopped laughing and said, it's not really funny, but I had known about this day, our anniversary, for a long time. We had planned it all out. But as I was going back home that day, I actually realized I totally forgot to buy an actual anniversary gift. And so Eric would explain that he stopped at a retail store called Shopko to buy his wife a hanging plant because he knew his wife loved hanging plants, and he also knew the exact type to get her. And so Eric said he went inside the shop and he browsed the store's garden center for a while, but he didn't actually see the plant that his wife liked. So he drove to a different Shopko location, and he did find the right hanging plant there. And he paid for it, and then drove home, and then he and his wife had gone out for their celebration. And then right after he said that, Eric looked like he had just remembered something out of the blue. And he pulled his wallet out, and he took out a receipt for this plant, and he slid it across the table to Kristofferson, saying that he had held on to this receipt in case his wife didn't like the plant, and so she could return it. Kristofferson looked at the receipt, and it did confirm that Eric had bought this plant at 6:15 p.m. at the Shopko. After that, Kristofferson asked Eric to wait in the interview room while he reached out to Eric's friend to confirm that they really had met up on that Friday to grout and tile the bathroom. And so Kristofferson got the friend's number, stepped into the hall, and gave him a call, and the friend confirmed that Eric had left his house around 5:30 that evening. And so at this point, Kristofferson concluded that based on Eric's timeline, he didn't really have enough time to have also driven to his parents' house to kill them, between leaving his friend's house and then getting that plant at Shopko. So Kristofferson did not think Eric was as likely of a suspect as he originally seemed. So Kristofferson walked back into the interview room and asked Eric if he could think of anyone at all, who may have had a reason to harm his parents. Eric hesitated, and then with obvious reluctance in his voice, he said they should look into his sister, Cindy, and her husband, Patrick. When asked to explain why, Eric said that Cindy had been having some very serious financial problems. She was living paycheck to paycheck, earning close to minimum wage, working for a collections agency. Meanwhile, her husband, Patrick, didn't work at all. They had a mortgage and other expenses, and Cindy had been borrowing money from their parents to help make ends meet. In fact, she actually owed her parents tens of thousands of dollars. And then also, Eric said that his sister's husband, Patrick, was just generally kind of a bad guy. And also, Eric knew his parents did not like Patrick at all and often referred to him as a, quote, lazy bum. But Eric said he wasn't sure if his parents even knew just how bad things really were between Cindy and her husband, Patrick. Eric said Patrick had a violent temper and had once pulled a gun on Cindy after she threatened to leave him. Patrick allegedly told Cindy that the only way she'd be leaving him was in a body bag. Kristofferson was shocked at this information. If this was true, this was a huge red flag. The idea that Patrick had literally pulled a gun out and actually threatened to kill someone certainly made him a pretty big suspect. But Kristofferson kind of tempered his reaction to this and just thanked Eric for coming in and speaking to him. And then after Eric was gone, Kristofferson immediately reached out to Cindy to set up a meeting. The following day, Cindy showed up at the station and joined Kristofferson in the interview room. And right away, Kristofferson could tell Cindy seemed very rattled and sort of nervous. But Kristofferson didn't react to that and just thanked her for coming in and reiterated how sorry he was for her loss. His voice was calm and friendly, and he told Cindy there was no reason to be nervous. This was just an interview, not an interrogation. Cindy nodded, but still seemed very nervous. Kristofferson began the interview by asking Cindy when was the last time she spoke to her parents. and Cindy said she had spoken to her father on Friday morning, so the day that Dennis and Myrna were killed. Cindy said during this conversation with her dad, she had talked about her and her husband's mounting financial troubles. She had told her father that she and Patrick had absolutely no money, and to make matters worse, the unemployment check that Patrick was expecting hadn't arrived yet. Cindy said her father had been sort of blunt with her that morning. He criticized her husband for not supporting her and their daughter, and then he told Cindy he would not keep giving her any more money. Cindy looked like she was about to cry. She told Christofferson that her father's rejection was so upsetting for her, and she felt like Eric was the favorite child, the golden boy, while she was just a disappointment to her parents. After that, Christofferson asked her what she had done the rest of that day after she had spoken to her father. Cindy said she'd been at work until about 4:45 p.m. She left the office and stopped at a convenience store to buy some groceries, and then she got home between 5:30 and 6. And once she was home, she spent the rest of the evening with her daughter and husband. Christofferson took down Cindy's work information and said that was all he needed from her for now, and that he would follow up if necessary. After the interview, members of the investigative team went to Cindy's office and obtained her punch cards. And the punch cards would show that yes, Cindy had clocked out at 4:45 p.m. Next, they drove over to the convenience store where Cindy said she had done her grocery shopping, and the manager of that store gave them access to the surveillance footage from that day, and it didn't take investigators long to find Cindy in the video shopping in the store during the time frame she said she was. And so, just like with her brother, the investigators concluded that basically based on the timeline, there wasn't enough time for Cindy to have gone to her parents' house and killed them. But Agent Christofferson couldn't completely rule Cindy out yet. Even if she wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, what's to say her husband, Patrick, the man who apparently had, a temper and had previously drawn a gun on Cindy and threatened her life, who's to say he didn't pull the trigger? And also maybe Cindy was involved somehow with the murder, that she helped coordinate it for Patrick. But before Christofferson jumped to that conclusion and brought Patrick in and really drilled him hard on what he was doing on that day, he first wanted to check to see if Eric's description of Patrick was actually accurate. And what Christofferson learned was Patrick had apparently cheated on Cindy at some point, he abused drugs, and he had difficulty holding down jobs. And because he was currently unemployed, he had a lot of free time and not a lot of money. Christofferson also learned that Myrna did not like Patrick so much that she had warned Cindy that if she stayed married to Patrick, there's a chance that she would just deny her getting her inheritance, that basically Patrick could not touch this money, and that was the reason she wouldn't be getting it. And Patrick was definitely aware of this, and also he was aware that Cindy's parents were apparently about to cut them both off financially. And so it did seem like Patrick had more motive to want Dennis and Myrna dead than anybody else. A few days after the murders, Christofferson, along with an investigator from the sheriff's department, waited for Patrick inside of an interview room. Eventually, another officer led Patrick into the room, and Patrick sat down on the other side of the table. Patrick was very physically imposing. He was tall with broad shoulders, and he had short cropped hair, and he had spent some time in the Marine Corps. But once he was settled in his seat, he made it very clear that he wanted to help the investigators in any way he could. And the investigators actually couldn't help but look at each other really quickly, like they couldn't believe how soft-spoken Patrick seemed. I mean, this guy had this horrible reputation, and right now, he seemed like he was just very cooperative. But Christofferson knew looks can be deceiving, so he got right to the point, and he asked Patrick how he spent his day on Friday, May 21st, the day his in-laws were killed. And Patrick said in a very soft voice that he had spent the day just kind of hanging around the house by himself, watching TV and playing Xbox. After this, the county investigator said to Patrick, that's not exactly an airtight alibi. If he was home by himself, how could anybody corroborate that? Patrick said he understood, but he really was telling the truth. That's what he did on Friday. And then he also said he always had a great relationship with Dennis and Myrna, and he would never do anything to hurt them or to cause his wife any pain. At this point, Christofferson was nearly certain that Patrick was just lying, because basically everyone they had spoken to had said that the in-laws did not get along with Patrick. They called him the lazy bum, and they totally resented him and did not like him. So how could he possibly have a good relationship with them? And so Christofferson didn't waste any time. He leaned in and told Patrick that police had heard his relationship with the victims had been strained, to say the least, and so it seemed very likely that right now, Patrick was lying. Christofferson also pointed out Patrick's weak alibi and the fact that as a former Marine, he would know how to use a gun. Patrick didn't deny any of this and said he did own several firearms, but he said again that he really had been at home playing video games that past Friday, and he really didn't have anything to do with the murders. Christofferson told Patrick that they might have a better idea if he really was telling the truth if he allowed them to search his house. Patrick looked at both investigators, and his voice stayed calm and soft like it had the whole time, and he said yes, he would consent to a search of his home because he had nothing to hide. So not long after this interview, investigators did search Patrick and Cindy's house, and they would find multiple firearms which were confiscated. They also seized Patrick's Xbox and brought it into the crime lab for analysis. Investigators were able to see exactly when the Xbox game console was being used, and it did seem to confirm everything Patrick had said, because the Xbox had been used all day on Friday, suggesting Patrick really had been at home playing video games at the time Myrna and Dennis were murdered. And also, after closer analysis, the guns seized in Patrick and Cindy's house were not the same ones that fired the .22 caliber bullets that killed Dennis and Myrna. And so, just like Eric and Cindy, Patrick suddenly had a solid alibi. The following day, Eric walked outside of his house, he opened up his mailbox, and he found a single item inside. It was a plain white envelope with no postage on it. Eric took the envelope inside of his house, he opened it up, and he looked at the paper that was inside. And when Eric saw what was on it, his face turned pale and he started breathing heavily. His wife walked into the room and saw Eric staring at this note and clenching his jaw and shaking his head, and she asked him, "What's going on? What does the note say?" Eric walked over to his wife and just held the note out for her to read. And in strange, weirdly stilted handwriting were the words, "Fixed you." That's all it said, "Fixed you." Eric's wife immediately picked up her phone and dialed 911. A few minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived at the house and took this strange note into evidence. And also the deputy noticed that Eric was incredibly rattled and could barely talk. In fact, the sheriff's deputy said it seemed like Eric could actually have a heart attack. And as Eric tried to catch his breath, he would tell the deputy that he believed his parents' killer wrote this note, and somehow those two words, "fixed you," meant they were coming for him and his family next. The note forced Christofferson to view this case from a totally new angle. If somebody really did have a vendetta against the Colas, and that's why they killed Dennis and Myrna, it did seem entirely possible that they might also target the rest of the Cola family. And so that possibility obviously put way more pressure on Christofferson and his team to solve this case quickly. But the only thing that Christofferson kept coming back to that just seemed like it had to be at the heart of this case was money. Not only did Dennis and Myrna have property, investments, and huge insurance policies before they died, but also Eric had been a successful day trader and had lots of money too. So Christofferson decided he would dig deep as he could into the family's finances, hoping that might point him to a potential killer. And so back at the station, Christofferson and a forensic accountant dug through stacks of Dennis and Myrna's printed bank statements, and also they reviewed the couple's most recent online banking transactions. And as they looked at that recent online activity, something absolutely shocked them. And at first, Christofferson literally couldn't believe what he was looking at, like this had to be a mistake, because it was something so outlandish, it just shouldn't have been there. There was a transaction made on May 22nd, 2010, the day after the murders. The transaction showed a check that was cashed from Dennis's account for $50,000. Now, the name on the signature line of the check was Dennis Cola, but it was the name on the account that this check had been deposited into that really caught the investigators' attention. And suddenly, the whole focus of the investigation shifted. Police immediately served a search warrant on this particular person's house, and inside they found a pair of plain white envelopes very similar to the envelope that Eric had found in his mailbox that contained the words "fixed you" on it. And when those envelopes were compared to the one that Eric had received, they contained the same manufacturing defect, proving that the envelope containing that "fixed you" note had come from this individual's house. Then a forensic document examiner looked at that $50,000 check, and he quickly determined that Dennis's signature on this check was a forgery. What's more, the forged handwriting perfectly matched the handwriting on the "fixed you" note. And so now Agent Christofferson was very confident that the person who wrote that note and then also forged the check was Dennis and Myrna's killer. Based on financial records, evidence from the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is what police believe happened to Dennis and Myrna Cola on May 21st, 2010. Around 5:30 p.m., the killer, who was inside of the Cola's house at this point, slowly walked down the hallway in the direction of the home office. They watched Myrna from the hall until they were sure she was totally preoccupied with what she was doing on her computer. Then the killer slowly walked upstairs, entered one of the bedrooms, opened the closet door, and lifted the .22 caliber rifle from where it was resting on the floor. They also reached up and grabbed some ammo from the box on the shelf, then loaded the rifle and walked back downstairs. Then the killer made their way back to the home office, and they looked inside and saw Myrna was still preoccupied with the computer. And so the killer stepped forward into the room, they raised the rifle, aimed it at Myrna's head, and then pulled the trigger. A .22 caliber bullet lodged in Myrna's brain. She died instantly, slumping over her computer, with her fingers still near the last keys she had pressed. Confident that Myrna was dead, the killer crossed the room and closed the blinds. Then they walked back into the hallway, went down to the kitchen, and sat down at the table, and began to wait. About 20 minutes later, the killer heard Dennis's truck pull up outside. The killer heard the sound of the truck door opening and closing, and then the sounds of footsteps getting louder as Dennis approached the front of the house. At this point, the killer slowly got up and moved towards the back of the kitchen and put their back against the wall, sort of out of view, and continued to wait. A moment later, the killer heard Dennis's footsteps now inside of the house, his keys jangling in his hand. Then the killer saw Dennis walk into the kitchen, and immediately they raised their rifle, aimed it at Dennis's head, and fired. Dennis was dead before he even hit the ground. The killer stared at the body on the floor, and then walked back upstairs and returned the rifle to the closet, failing to notice they were not placing it in the exact spot where it had been before. After that, the killer walked to Dennis and Myrna's bedroom and opened up the dresser drawers to make it look like the home had been robbed. Then the killer opened up the drawer on the nightstand, tore out a check from Dennis's checkbook, and then wrote themselves a $50,000 check and forged Dennis's signature. The killer slipped the check into their pocket, walked back downstairs, left the house, and drove to a Shopko store to buy a hanging plant for an anniversary gift, making sure to keep the receipt to help corroborate the alibi they knew they would need. Dennis and Myrna's own son, Eric Kola, had been their killer. It would turn out Eric had only visited one Shopko store that day to buy a plant, not the two stores like he had told police. And so when detectives obtained the surveillance footage from the Shopko Eric claimed to have visited first, before going to the second one and buying the plant, well, they expected to see him browsing the garden center in this first shop, but the investigators spent hours and hours reviewing the footage from multiple cameras inside and outside the store, but there was no trace of Eric anywhere. And investigators knew that if he had not gone to that store and only went to the second one, well, he would easily have enough time to kill his parents. And so his alibi began to fall apart. And then, when investigators delved deeper into the Kola's financial records, they found that forged $50,000 check, and it was made out to Eric. And then also, when investigators began probing Eric's personal finances, they quickly discovered that Eric had been lying to them. Eric was not raking in $7,000 to $10,000 a month from day trading as he claimed. In fact, he was in serious financial trouble. His day trading had been successful in the beginning, but then the economy had tanked, and Eric's financial position plummeted, leaving him desperately broke and $150,000 in debt. But Eric continued keeping up appearances. He drove luxury cars, spoiled his kids, and retained membership at an exclusive country club. He presented himself to friends as this financial wizard, but all the while, he was actually borrowing huge sums of money from his father and then losing it on the stock market. Investigators had learned from Dennis's colleagues that Dennis was an extraordinarily generous man, the kind of guy who would give you the shirt off his back if he thought you were in need. But Dennis's generosity had its limits. He had reached the end of his rope with his kids because he had given Eric hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he had helped pay Cindy's mortgage while her husband sat at home unemployed playing video games. And in fact, only days before the murders, Dennis had told a work colleague at the pharmacy that he was officially cutting off his children financially. Enough was enough. When police confronted Eric about the forged $50,000 check, Eric explained that his father had given him a blank check the day before he was killed, and Eric had deposited it on Saturday, having no idea his parents were dead. But police didn't believe that, because Dennis had just told his colleague that he planned to stop giving his children money. So police searched Eric's home, and they found the envelopes that matched the envelope from the Fixed You note. Eric had written that note himself and put it in his own mailbox. And so by this point, police were very sure Eric had killed his parents, and they had enough probable cause to arrest him. Police believe Eric Kola murdered his mother and father just so he could use the inheritance money to pull himself out of debt. The case against Eric was entirely circumstantial, but it was strong enough that a jury found him guilty on 2 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. Eric did not receive a dime of his parents' estate, but his 2 children did inherit $740,000, which they split between them. Eric continues to maintain his innocence. Around 8:30 p.m. on December 29, 1972, passengers inside of JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, heard over the intercom that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was now boarding. About 30 minutes later, all 176 passengers, which included the 13 crew members, had made it on board, and then at that point, the 13 crew members began making their final preparations for takeoff. Flight 401 was a very expensive and recently introduced model of plane by Eastern Airlines called the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, and it was both unbelievably technologically advanced and unbelievably enormous. It sat up to 400 passengers, which meant instead of having 4 seats to a row like you would expect inside of a passenger jet, the L-1011s had 8 seats per row, and they had 2 levels. There was the main level, which was the main cabin where all the passengers were, and then there was a second level, a lower level, that was only accessible via 2 small elevators that could barely fit 1 person inside of them in the back of the aircraft. And down on this lower level was a full-size kitchen, which had ovens and refrigerators, and also at the back of this lower level was a lounge area for flight staff. The pilot that night was Bob Loft, who was a strikingly handsome 55-year-old man with over 30,000 hours of flying experience, which for reference is a ton of flying experience. Captain Bob was known as a perfectionist who exuded confidence and who was cool under pressure. After Bob had boarded the aircraft, he had made his way right into the cockpit, which is the very front of the plane where the pilots fly the plane, and he had sat down in the customary captain's seat, which was the front left seat. And then after he had sat down, his 10 years younger first officer or co-pilot, a man named Bert Stockstill, had joined him in the cockpit and sat down in the customary co-pilot seat, which was directly to the right of Captain Bob. And so after the pilot and co-pilot were both seated, the remaining 2 members of that night's cockpit crew came into the cockpit. Now, normally in most passenger jets, there were only 2 seats in the cockpit, but because L-1011 planes were so massive, there were 4 seats in the cockpit. And so one of the last 2 men who joined the cockpit was 51-year-old Don Repo, who was the flight's engineer. And despite him being this big, strong ox of a man, he was actually known as being fairly soft-spoken and very approachable. And so Don came into the cockpit, he said hello, and then he sat down in the seat right behind the co-pilot, Bert. And then a few seconds after Don, the last man came into the cockpit. It was 47-year-old Angelo Donadeo. Angelo was not actually part of that night's flight crew. However, he was an employee of Eastern Airlines, and that night he needed to get to Miami, and so the company had put him on Flight 401 and sat him in the 4th and final seat in the cockpit, right behind Captain Bob. Around 9:10 p.m., all pre-flight checks had been completed, all passengers were seated, as was the crew, and so Captain Bob began taxiing over to the runway. 10 minutes later, at 9:20 p.m., Captain Bob pushed the throttles forward and the plane began to take off. A few minutes later, and Flight 401 was airborne up in the night sky over New York, headed south towards Miami. For the next 2 hours, this flight was completely normal. In fact, it was so normal that one of the passengers, named Jerry Escow, actually wrote a letter while he was on the plane, telling Eastern Airlines how great their airline was and how smooth this flight was. His plan was, once they landed, to mail this letter to Eastern Airlines. But at 11:32 p.m., so 2 hours and 12 minutes after takeoff, this flight would go from being very routine and normal to being anything but. At 11:32 p.m., Captain Bob began his approach to Miami International Airport, but when he lowered the plane's landing gear, his co-pilot Bert noticed they had a problem. L-1011 jets, like 401, have 3 pieces of landing gear. They have wheels that come down under the left wing, they have wheels that come down under the right wing, and they have wheels that pop out of the nose of the plane. And each of these pieces of landing gear has a corresponding little light bulb, a green light bulb inside the cockpit, that once that piece of landing gear comes down and locks in place and is ready to be landed on, its green light will go on inside of the cockpit. But when Captain Bob lowered their landing gear, his co-pilot, Bert, noticed only 2 of the lights came on. The one that did not light up was the nose landing gear. Now, Captain Bob and the other men in the cockpit, when they saw this issue, they immediately assumed it had to be the light bulb itself that was faulty, not the actual nose landing gear, because this plane was brand new, it had been checked before they left, so the likelihood of the nose landing gear being faulty was incredibly slim. And so Captain Bob, while maintaining his approach towards Miami International, he retracted the landing gear, and then once it had come back into the plane, he just lowered it again, thinking this time all 3 lights would come on. But once again, once the landing gear was deployed the second time, still the nose landing gear light did not come on. And so frustrated, Captain Bob hopped on the radio and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control and told them that he could not confirm his landing gear was actually safe to land on, and so they would have to circle around for a bit in the sky and get it figured out. And so Miami Air Traffic Control acknowledged what Captain Bob said and then directed Captain Bob to fly out over the nearby Everglades, which is a massive wetlands area in Florida, and to stay out over the Everglades away from other traffic until they fixed the problem. And so once Flight 401 was out over the Everglades flying in a circular pattern, Captain Bob and his co-pilot set the plane to autopilot so that it would maintain a constant altitude of 2,000 feet and a constant speed of 200 miles per hour. And so once the plane was all set, Captain Bob and his co-pilot Bert began fiddling with this front nose gear indicator light bulb, which they were convinced was faulty. And so they started by pressing on the light, and when that didn't work, they began twisting it, and when that didn't work, they actually pulled the light bulb off the panel and kind of blew the dirt and grime off of it, and then they jammed it back into the panel, but as soon as they did, not only did it not go back on, but they realized they had put it in sideways, and so they couldn't actually get it out again. And so now they're thinking, this light's not going to go on at all, we need to find another way to make sure the nose landing gear has come down. And so Captain Bob at this point is totally frustrated, and so he turns around and he looks at Don Repo, the flight engineer who's sitting right behind the co-pilot, and he tells Don to go down into the hellhole and directly inspect the front landing gear himself. So the hellhole is a space right below the cockpit, and the way you get to it is through a trap door in the floor in the center of the cockpit. And then once down in the hellhole, there is this window that looks straight towards the front of the aircraft where you could look out and actually see the front landing gear and you could make sure it was down or not. And so Don Repo, he gets out of his seat and he opens up the hellhole trap door and he makes his way down below. Meanwhile, 2,000 feet below Flight 401, a 43-year-old man named Robert Marquise, along with a friend of his, were looking for frogs in the Everglades riding around on Robert's airboat. An airboat is a flat-bottom boat with this huge fan on the back of it that propels it forward. It's popular in the Everglades because the water depth is so shallow. At points in the Everglades, the water's only a couple of inches deep. And so all around these two guys, it is totally pitch black out. There are no buildings or people for miles and miles and miles. Their only light source is Robert's headlamp. And so at some point, Robert turns off the airboat and he and his friend are just standing in the middle of it, kind of scanning around on either side. And all around them, they can hear the sound of alligators growling and snakes and frogs moving about the tall grass. And as they're just kind of silently looking around them, out of the corner of Robert's eye, he sees something. And so he looks up right as he sees this huge orange and yellow flash that kind of came out of the ground roughly 5 miles away from where they were. And basically, as soon as Robert saw it, this flash dissipated and it was just totally gone. And so he turned to his friend who had not seen this flash. And Robert said, "Hey, let's go investigate. Let's see what that was." And so Robert fired up his boat again and he began flying across the Everglades straight in the direction of where he saw this flash. And after 15 minutes of cruising at 40 miles per hour across this dark expanse, they reached the area where this flash had been, and Robert and his friend, they just could not believe what they were looking at. About 20 minutes earlier, back up inside of Flight 401, when Captain Bob turned around in his seat to tell the flight engineer, Don Repo, to go down into the hellhole, it's believed that Captain Bob nudged the steering wheel with his leg. And this little nudge was enough to disengage the plane's autopilot, which sent the plane into a gradual descent. But nobody noticed. Because, one, it was totally pitch black outside, the Everglades below them, there's no lights, there's nothing, and there was no moon that night, and so when they're looking out the window, there would have been no visual cues that they were going down, up, or anything. It just would have looked like a total void outside. And two, the descent they were now suddenly in was so gradual, it would not have felt like they were tumbling out of the sky, it would have felt like they were just cruising as expected. And three, all of the men in the cockpit were completely fixated on this light bulb problem. In fact, they were so fixated that when an alarm went off inside of the cockpit telling them they had dipped below their intended altitude of 2,000 feet, they were now going down, nobody noticed. Although, to their credit, this alarm only sounded once and it wasn't that loud. And so not long after Don Repo had gone down into the hellhole, the plane crashed into the Everglades. No one on board Flight 401, from the cockpit crew to the passengers to the other flight staff, had any idea they were in an emergency until they hit the ground. And when they hit the ground, the plane exploded, and that was what Robert Marquis saw when he looked up and saw that yellow and orange flash. And so Robert and his friend, they speed over to the crash site, and when they get there, they are the first ones there. And even though they're looking out and they can hear the sound of all these people screaming and crying and moaning, they can't see anything because the fire from this huge explosion was already out because the swampy wetlands had pretty much immediately extinguished it. And even though the plane had crashed into the ground at over 200 miles per hour, it had not struck the ground at a very steep angle because basically the plane was in this gradual descent pattern and just kind of coasted until it hit the ground. And so that, combined with the soft, muddy ground of the Everglades, meant that the impact of the plane hitting the ground was not nearly as violent as other plane crashes were. And that ultimately saved lives. In fact, dozens of passengers survived the initial impact with the ground. But many of them were left with these horrible injuries, or they were trapped within the wreckage, or both. When Robert and his friend arrived at the edge of the crash scene, Robert lifted up his headlamp and began to scan, and he saw all these body parts sticking out of the ground, and then his light rested on the first survivor he saw, and it was this man whose clothes had been completely burned off from the explosion. All he had on was just a little bit of his socks on both ankles. And this man was still strapped into the seat that he had been on the plane, and when the plane had broken up, his seat had fallen forward into the mud, pinning this man's upper body and most of his face under several inches of water. And so as Robert had scanned over with his light had hit this man's face, and he had looked up and pleaded with Robert and his friend to come get him before he drowned. And so Robert and his friend, they jumped off their boat and ran over to this guy and pulled the chair up and out of the water, saving this guy's life. But as soon as he was up and out of the water, Robert and his friend began hearing more calls from other people in the darkness screaming for help. Robert and his friend would do their absolute best to save as many people as they possibly could, but there was just too many people who needed saving and not enough time. About 30 minutes after Robert and his friend had arrived at the scene, the Coast Guard showed up in helicopters, and they, along with Robert and his friend, would spend the entire night pulling as many people to safety as they possibly could. By the time the sun came up on the following day, there were no other survivors left to save. All told, 99 people perished and 77 survived. Amongst the dead were Captain Bob Loft and his co-pilot Bert Stockstill and their flight engineer Don Repo, who had gone down into the hellhole. Amongst these survivors was Angelo Donadeo, the fourth man in the cockpit, as well as Jerry Ascow, the man who ironically had written that letter to Eastern Airlines saying how wonderful that flight had been. A major investigation following the crash would confirm that the reason Flight 401 went down was because of a number of factors, most notably human error. The investigation would also confirm that the nose landing gear was working perfectly fine. The light bulb not coming on was a result of the light bulb being burned out. Following the investigation, Eastern Airlines would make every effort to compensate both the survivors of the crash and also families of those who were killed in the crash. Eastern Airlines would also make major changes to their training for their pilots and co-pilots and anybody that was ever going to be in the cockpit to ensure this type of disaster never happened again. But this was not the end of the story for Flight 401. For almost 3 years after the crash, hundreds of Eastern Airline employees began to experience a terrifying phenomenon. Now, at first, many of these employees were going to their superiors and reporting what happened to them, but very early on, Eastern Airlines made it clear that they didn't want anybody to talk about this. Anytime an employee made one of these reports about this phenomenon, they were either sent to the psychiatrist or they were just fired. However, despite this intense pressure from Eastern Airlines to their employees to be quiet about what was going on inside of their ranks, there were still some very brave employees who had firsthand experience with this terrifying phenomenon who still came forward and told their stories to the press and to journalists. They just did it anonymously. And so I'm going to tell you 2 of the most chilling accounts from those employees. Keep in mind, the names used in these stories have all been changed. In March of 1973, so 3 months after Flight 401 had crashed in the Everglades, an Eastern Airlines flight attendant named Ginny was assigned to a flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Working with her on this flight was her very close friend and fellow flight attendant, a woman named Denise. Neither of these 2 women were on Flight 401 when it crashed. The plane these 2 women would be working on their flight to Florida was called number 318 by Eastern Airlines, and it was an L-1011 just like Flight 401 had been. In fact, plane number 318 actually had some original parts from Flight 401 on it, because it would turn out after that huge investigation was done on the crash, the investigators discovered lots of parts from Flight 401 were still in pretty good shape. And so after rigorously testing them and ensuring they did really work, those parts were actually installed on other L-1011 jets in the Eastern Airline fleet. Now, for the record, this was not considered an inappropriate thing to do. These parts were extremely expensive and they worked perfectly fine and they were not involved in causing Flight 401 to crash. And so no one batted an eye when Eastern Airlines put these parts on their other planes. So Ginny and Denise, along with several other Eastern Airlines flight attendants, board plane number 318, and after takeoff, the flight attendants began going through the very long and drawn-out process of getting food and drink for the nearly 200 people on board the flight. And so the way the flight attendants divvied up the work is they would have some of the attendants on the main level of the plane in the cabin taking orders from all the passengers, and then the other flight attendants would be down on the lower level, the second level of the plane where the kitchen was, preparing all the food and drinks. And so at some point during this process, Denise, who was up on the main level helping with taking orders, realized she didn't have anything to do. She had taken all the orders she could, and so she decided she would head down to the second level, to the kitchen, where her good friend Ginny was, to see if she could help her. But ironically, as Denise got in the elevator in the back of the plane and began heading down to the second level, Ginny, who was on the second level, discovered she did not have anything to do. She'd already prepped her cart, and so she had gotten into the other elevator and began going up to the main level to see if Denise needed any help. And so the 2 women literally passed each other in their elevators, but didn't see each other. And so once Ginny arrived at the main level, the cabin level, she got off the elevator and she walked down the aisle and she began asking around to the other attendants if they knew where Denise was. And they would tell her, oh, she just left a minute ago to go down to see you. And so after a couple of minutes, Ginny would leave the main level and go back down the elevator to the lower level to find Denise. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of the layout of the second level. So when you come down on either of those two elevators, when the doors open, you'd be looking down a stretch of hallway, basically the length of the plane from the back towards the front. And when you stepped off the elevator, you'd be stepping into the middle of the kitchen. Now, the kitchen was very, very cramped, and on the left side was a row of ovens that were all stacked up against each other, and then on the other side, on the right side, was a row of cabinets and cupboards. If you were to walk down the kitchen straight towards the front of the plane, you would eventually reach a wall that separated the kitchen to the lounge area, and there was a door slightly off to the right side on this wall that you could walk through to get into the lounge. So if you were standing in the kitchen and looking in the direction of this door, you wouldn't really be able to see into the lounge area because, again, the door was kind of off to the side. You would have to actually go over to the door and poke your head through to get a full unobstructed view of the lounge. And all the lounge was a couple of sofas and chairs kind of arranged in a circle. So Ginny has gotten back in the elevator and she's made her way back downstairs to continue looking for Denise. She gets down to the lower level, the doors open up, and she looks out into the kitchen, and Denise is not there. In fact, the kitchen is totally empty. And the door leading into the lounge area is shut, so she can't even see in part of the way into the lounge to see if anybody is in there. But the second Ginny stepped off the elevator into the kitchen, she immediately had this powerful sense that Denise was definitely down there somewhere on the second level with her, probably in the lounge area that she couldn't see. And because Ginny felt so confident that Denise was down there, she actually didn't start by calling out for Denise or walking to the door, opening it up, and looking into the lounge to make sure Denise was there. Instead, Ginny just turned to the left and went to the ovens and began preparing food for the attendants upstairs. And as she's making these plates of food, Ginny would periodically look over at the closed door leading into the lounge, kind of expecting it to open up at any point and see Denise walk out. But after a couple of minutes, no one had opened the door from the lounge, and Ginny was thinking to herself, I'm making quite a bit of noise over here. If anybody was down here, wouldn't they come out of the lounge and just see who it was? And because Ginny, again, had this really intense feeling that she was not alone down there, she began to think, wait a minute, is Denise playing a practical joke on me? Is she hiding in the lounge? Or is she hiding in one of the cabinets on the right side here, and she's going to jump out and grab me? And so the second Ginny began thinking about that, she became really paranoid. And so as she's making this food, she's pretty much constantly looking over at the door or kind of scanning behind her, waiting for Denise to launch out and scare her. But again, after several more minutes, Ginny didn't see anybody come out of the lounge and none of the cabinet doors opened up. It was just her down there. However, the longer she stayed down there, the stronger that feeling got that someone was in the room with her. And so now she can't even make her food. She's completely turned around, just scanning all around the kitchen, really at this point, hoping Denise jumps out to scare her. And when Denise didn't do that, Ginny just began walking over to the door that would lead into the lounge. And so when she reached the door, her heart was racing like mad. She reached down to the handle, she turned it, she pushed it open, and she poked her head in real quick, and there was no one in the lounge. But immediately, the second her head was in that room, that feeling that someone was down there with her spiked, and she got chills all over her body. And she ran into the back of the lounge and looked behind all of the chairs and sofas, praying at this point that Denise was going to be down there. But after looking all over the back of the lounge, there was no one there. And so finally, Ginny turns around and she's totally racked with fear. Because now she's on the very far end of the lounge. There's no one in the lounge. She knows there's no one in the kitchen. And here she is still getting that sensation that she was not alone down there. But she has to go all the way back across the lounge through that door into the kitchen to get back to the elevator so she can escape. And so Ginny almost instinctively moved immediately to the left side of the lounge and put her back up against the wall to make sure no one could be behind her. And then she began slowly inching her way along the left wall towards the door that was now open that would lead back into the kitchen. And as she's slowly shimmying along, her view of the kitchen is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the whole time she's thinking, I'm going to see someone in the kitchen because this sensation that someone is down here with me is not going away. But when she finally gets to the door and crosses into the kitchen, there's still no one there. And so she makes a run at that point to the elevator. She starts hitting the button. And as she's hitting the button, she's turning around and she has that awful feeling that someone's right behind her. And then finally the cart comes down. She hops inside the elevator. She shuts the doors. She hits the button and she begins going back up. When the elevator cart got back to the main level and the doors opened again, Ginny almost knocked over the flight attendant that was standing right outside of it, a woman named Mildred. And after Mildred and Ginny kind of regained their balance, they both looked at each other, and Mildred could see very clearly that Ginny looked horrible. She was totally pale, she was sweating. And so Mildred said, "Ginny, are you okay? What's going on?" And Ginny would just say, I don't know. I can't tell you what's going on. I don't know. But Mildred, instead of asking follow-up questions, just said, "Ginny, you need to come with me." And so Ginny would follow Mildred, who led them back around behind the elevators to the space in the back of the plane, kind of out of view of the passengers. And there, Ginny would find Denise. And Denise looked pale as a ghost, she was sweating, and looked totally shaken up. It would turn out when Ginny left the lower level for the first time to come up to the main level to look for Denise, and then learned that Denise was not up there, that Denise had actually gone down to look for Ginny. In those few minutes that Ginny was up on the main level before she went back down again to continue looking for Denise, Denise was on the lower level. And Denise would say when she got off the elevator into the kitchen, there was no one down there, but immediately she believed Ginny had to be down there because of this strong sense that she was not alone down there. However, when she opened up the door to look into the lounge, she didn't see anyone and it totally spooked her. She shut the door, she ran back to the elevators, and she went back upstairs. And as she was going up in her elevator car, who, once again, passed her in the other elevator car? Ginny. And so once again, the two women did not see each other. And so these two women, who had never experienced anything like this before in their lives, had nearly identical experiences, totally independent of each other, just a couple of minutes apart in the exact same space. It was just too many coincidences for them to totally write it off. And so that was a big reason why they felt like they had to come forward with their information. 1 month later, plane number 318, the same plane that Ginny and Denise had had their frightening experiences on, was at Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey, undergoing pre-flight checks from its crew before its flight to Miami that morning. After most of the checks were done, the passengers were allowed to board the plane, and then after it seemed like most of the passengers had arrived and taken their seats, the senior flight attendant, whose name was Sis, began counting the people on board the plane to make sure they had everyone. And after counting up and down the rows, she realized their head count was off by 1. They had one too many people. And so when Sis began recounting, she actually quickly identified the discrepancy. Sis was standing in first class in the aisle, and as she was counting down the left side of first class passengers, she noticed there was an Eastern Airlines captain seated in one of the seats. And so immediately Sis thought, oh, okay, I don't recognize this person, but since he's in uniform, he must be deadheading. Deadheading is a fairly common practice for airline employees where if they need to be on a particular flight but are not physically at the origin airport, they will just hop on another company flight that happens to be going to the airport they need to go to. And at least in the 1970s, it was not uncommon for employees not necessarily to tell the flight staff until they were literally on the plane, because these employees would just check the manifest, see if there were openings, and then climb on board. And so Sis assumed that was exactly what this man had done, and that was why he was unaccounted for, and it was why they had this extra person. And so she just needed to get his name to account for him. And so Sis turned and took a couple of steps until she was right in front of this guy who was still just seated looking straight ahead, and Sis introduced herself and asked him if he was deadheading. But the captain just continued to stare straight ahead and didn't even seem to register that Sis was talking to him, despite the fact that Sis was right on top of him and speaking very, very clearly and nobody else was talking. And so Sis, who was aware of the fact that this guy clearly should have heard her, just kind of waited for a second and then just asked again, hey, what's your name? I need to make sure that you are in fact deadheading. But again, this captain just sat there without moving and didn't remotely react to Sis. Now, by this point, another flight attendant named Diane had looked over and actually saw Sis having this strange interaction with this Eastern Airlines captain. And so Diane walked over and listened as Sis, for a third time, tried to get this guy's attention, but he still did nothing. And so Diane and Sis, they start looking at each other like, what do we do about this? And at some point, Sis just says, okay, I'm going to go tell the captain, he can deal with this. And so Diane stayed in the aisle next to this silent seated captain while Sis turned and walked towards the cockpit, and she told the captain, whose name was George. And so George, he leaves the cockpit with Sis by his side, and they start walking down the aisle back towards where this guy was and where Diane was. And by the time they get there, 6 other passengers kind of in the general vicinity had noticed something strange was going on. And so they were all kind of turned around in their seats, looking at this captain who was sitting there, and Diane and Sis and George kind of waiting to see what was going to happen. And so George and Sis, they walk right up alongside Diane and this seated silent captain, and George immediately crouched down to get a good look at this guy's face, because again, this captain is just looking straight ahead with a hat on, and so no one had really looked at him yet. And so George kneels down and he sees this guy's face for the first time, and he falls over and goes, "Oh my God, that's Bob Loft." The same Bob Loft who had died on Flight 401, the captain of Flight 401. George had known Bob really well and knew exactly what Bob looked like. But before Bob, Sis, Diane, or the 6 other passengers that were all watching could do anything, the seated, silent captain that looked exactly like Bob Loft vanished into thin air right in front of all of them. And immediately, these 6 passengers on board the flight that saw this happen became hysterical. They could not understand what they had just seen. People are screaming and crying, and George, Diane, and Sis, they were very shaken at what they saw, but they knew they were in charge of this flight. And so they tried to calm down the passengers, but then very quickly, they organized a search of the plane because they're telling themselves, no one can just disappear into thin air. This guy has to be somewhere on the plane. And so for over an hour, the passengers were told to stay in their seats and were told to stay calm while the flight crew searched every crevice, every nook and cranny of this flight to see if they could find this guy. But they never did. And so after a very long delay, plane number 318, along with its very shaken up passengers and flight crew, eventually rumbled out onto the runway and took off. When they landed in Miami, the first thing George, Diane, and Sis all did is they went in and filed a report about what they had seen, about this vanishing person. But Eastern Airline didn't do anything about their reports. In fact, the logbook where these reports were kept was conspicuously missing a couple of weeks later when some other employees of the airline heard about this vanishing person and wanted to read the reports themselves. And when these employees went to their superiors and asked if they could get this logbook, the answer from the top was, George, Diane, and Sis never filed those reports. There was no vanishing person. This whole thing is a bunch of crap. But George, Diane, and Sis all said, we filed those reports. And apparently some other pilots within Eastern Airlines had actually seen the reports before the logbook went missing. And they would tell other people that what they read was terrifying. Over the next 2 years, there would be an astounding number of other totally unexplainable events that took place on other planes within Eastern Airlines' fleet. However, the strange events only occurred on L-1011 jets that had parts on them from the crashed Flight 401. Some of these unexplained events included more sightings of the silent seated captain who looked just like Bob Loft. And in fact, one of those sightings was by an Eastern Airlines executive who, after seeing this captain vanish into thin air right in front of him, the executive freaked out and ran off the plane and demanded the plane be searched top to bottom. But like the last search, nothing was found. On another occasion, the catering company that loaded food directly into the second level of these L-1011s, basically right into the kitchen, one of their staff spotted a man wandering around the lower level that looked just like Don Repo, the flight engineer from the doomed Flight 401. And when this staff member spoke to this man who looked like Don Repo turned towards him and then vanished into thin air. The catering company was so scared when this happened that they refused to go back into the plane, and it caused a massive delay. On another flight, on board plane number 318, the pilot and co-pilot began hearing banging coming from the hellhole, and when the pilot got up and opened up the hellhole and went down below and shined his light, he didn't see anything, but when he went to climb back up into the cockpit, he looked up, and standing in the cockpit was once again Don Repo looking straight down at him, who then promptly vanished right in front of him. On another flight, a female passenger in coach, who had been quiet the entire flight, suddenly began screaming hysterically. And when they went up to her and asked her what was wrong, she was pointing at the seat next to her and said a man had suddenly appeared right next to her. He did not walk in, he just appeared next to her, and then when she began screaming, he vanished right in front of her. This woman was so upset that when they landed finally in Phoenix, Arizona, she had to be restrained in a straitjacket when they pulled her off the plane. But as terrifying as all of these events were, there was at least one instance where these apparitions appeared to be helpful to the people on the plane. One captain said he walked into the cockpit, and standing in there was flight engineer Don Repo, and Don promptly told the captain about a specific malfunction in one of the engines before Don vanished in front of this captain. Now, this captain was horrified at what he had just seen, but he did actually go down and have that engine looked at, and sure enough, the malfunction that Don Repo said it had. Then finally, in 1974, all of these strange events just came to an abrupt stop. Now, no one knows exactly why, but in 1974, Eastern Airlines, despite telling the world they didn't believe any of the reports of these strange happenings on their planes, despite that year, they went into every single one of their L-1011 jets, and they removed any parts that had been placed on them from the crashed Flight 401. Despite the fact none of those parts were faulty. They were removing perfectly good parts, and they never gave a reason. And after they did that, all the sightings just stopped. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the Amazon Music follow button to a Ouija board session, and once everyone's fingers are on the pointer, ask if anyone likes the Amazon Music follow button, and then subtly move the pointer over no. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen's